Well, welcome all of you to our City Council workshop meeting. And just to make sure that everyone understands what we are doing tonight, we're going to hear some information that we've been asking for from a group called ARUP that's going to help us just simply with part of the process of looking at our Convention Center, Performing Arts Center. So tonight we're hearing it for the first time, like many of you. And so like all of our workshops, we typically don't take public comment, nor would I encourage it, because we're all hearing it for the first time. I'm thrilled that we have people that are sitting here in the audience that are going to be digesting this information for the very first time, and would encourage you to get more involved as we work our way through this process. Eventually, at some point in time, we hope that this will come back to the council for some kind of formal presentation where we do take public comment, because that typically would lead potentially to a vote of this board. Tonight, we're not voting up here on anything tonight. There will be no votes taken. We don't take votes during workshop meetings. And so there's really not a reason to have public comment because there's no vote taken. But again, let me reiterate. There will be a process going forward that we want all of you, we want the entire community, not just the 50 or 60 people sitting in this auditorium. We want the entire community to get involved in this process as we figure out our way through here. And you can certainly provide input nearly 24/7. I'll give you Councilmember Meissner's cell phone here in a minute. And encourage people to provide input all the way through. But let's digest this. We're going to hear information for the first time, and then we'll work our way through the process. Hopefully that's fair enough. Robert, are you ready to move forward?
Well, good evening. Good to see you again. I'm going to talk, I'll make some intro comments and then we'll jump into the presentation. And as the mayor indicated, it will be lengthy. It's to cover the breadth of the work that we've been doing over the last 4 years. It's been a deliberate process, and I'll talk about that. We've actually been wrestling with the issue of the future of our convention and performing arts facilities for over 10 years. And we've been doing that because we've had a problem of aging infrastructure, of continued or growing maintenance problems, and also a number of functionality issues that have presented problems for us on both the convention side as well as the performing arts side. And to be honest with you, I've been somewhat paralyzed by the issue because of its significant scope, because of the cost associated with addressing these issues, and of course because of the number of stakeholders that include, of course, a lot more people than here, but really all our residents, those who have used or have the potential of using Century 2. Throughout this whole process, over 10 years that we've been talking about a C2 solution, we've lost market share, and we've seen a drop in economic benefit to our community because of what's happening with our facilities. So tonight, what we plan on doing is outlining a path forward for you, one that has been derived from a deliberate and thoughtful process. As I said, we've been doing this work since 2013. I'm going to ask staff to first review key steps in this process, which include a market study that was performed, schematic designs that were put together to give us some concepts that we could then take and put into a cost-benefit study. So all that work has been completed, and John D'Angelo, in just a second, will summarize that for you. And then, as the mayor indicated, we asked ARUP to come in with all of that data and take a look at the market, determine what, and to analyze the funding and delivery alternatives for coming up with a convention center and performing arts solution. And then at the end, I'm going to list a number of recommendations for moving forward. And the one thing I do want to say is these are preliminary recommendations. They're designed to spur discussion and to help us as we go through what I hope is a pretty comprehensive community engagement process. I think it's time for us to finish the analysis and move forward with the community discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John to go ahead and bring you up to speed with some of the work that's been done since 2013.
Thank you. What I'm going to try to do is go through the history of the studies that we've been doing. Certainly, if any time, stop me if you have questions so I can answer them. We started this work in November 2013. The Visit Wichita commissioned to study a market assessment. Convention Sports and Leisure was the consultant that we used. They're nationally recognized. They identified the types of convention opportunities that were currently exist in 2013. We also, at the same time, as you will remember, with the help of the performing arts groups, the Arts Council, we commissioned a study on performing arts assessment. It was commissioned in May of 2014. Again, it was to identify what kind of the direction is of what our performing arts needs are and where should we be going. The city then commissioned a study about a renovation expansion concept design. It was done by Populous and GMLV. And when we say concept, what this was looking at it from a block planning state. It was not looking at it from a designing a building state. We also did a complex facility assessment. We looked at the current facility and said if we do nothing and just updated it and improved it, what would that look like and what sort of costs would be borne by that? And then we put those together and we did a cost-benefit study to say, okay, if we invest the public dollars, what sort of return for those dollars would it look like and how does that look? And then finally, we've done the last piece of this study, which Ignacio will be talking about, which is the ARUP study, which is really looking at the financial considerations. Just to give you a perspective, this is kind of a history. We've used this in many presentations, but just so we put it in perspective, the forum is dedicated in 1911. It was replaced by the current building in 1969. Bob Brown Expo was in 86, and the Hyatt was done in 97. As you can tell, the age of these facilities are starting to become the challenge, both in terms of market as well as the facility itself. When we start again with the 2013 study and Bill Kroger's study, the current convention facilities in Wichita puts the community at a competitive disadvantage. Both my staff and the Visit Wichita see that every day as we bid on projects and we look to try to get conventions to come to our community. There's a number of critical deficiencies pertaining to event logistics, space levels, aesthetics, the marketability of this facility. These sort of things have significantly reduced our competitiveness. The other challenge with the round building, which continues as it originally was designed to be both a convention center and a performing arts center, as it services the convention business, the pie shape is not a desirable feature for event planners. One of the main things we did was we went out to 2,500 convention and trade shows using what's called, and this is an industry standard, the MINT database, and surveyed event planners and asking them, what's the likelihood of you coming to Wichita? Obviously, about 62% of those said they weren't likely to come here, but of the 2,500 we did, 38% of them identified that there was the opportunity to look at Wichita as a possibility. When we talk about numbers here, we're only trying to capture a small percentage of that. About 3 to 10% of that captured market of that 400 is really what we're after on convention business. And a lot of this is small regional events with some national ties. Peer cities have developed new centers in the last 15 years. Wichita ranks lowest in prime square footage in convention centers. This chart shows you ballroom space, which we rank at the bottom, and then you're seeing exhibit hall space. And you would say, well, look, we have 170,000 square feet. That puts us about in the middle. The reality of what's called prime space, which we'll talk about as part of the building program, we only have 63,000. That's 30-foot ceilings, 30-foot grid pattern for the utilities. A lot of Bob Brown Expo, which is 92,000 square feet, has a 14-foot ceiling. Both exhibitors and event planners don't prefer that space. The other thing that's important is subdividable space in the convention business. The ability to take a large space like Expo and subdivide it. We recently had a medical group here. They used 60% of the hall, which meant 40% of the hall was unused, and basically we used pipe and drape to curtain it off. That's both inefficient and also doesn't allow us to rent the other spaces. Again, when we talk about state-of-the-art industrial characteristics, it's column-free, contiguous space. It's ceiling heights of 30 feet. It's a 2-to-1 ratio, like the picture before, and it's subdividable. Significant pre-function space is also a critical factor, as well as back-of-house space into the exhibit hall. We have some real limitations when it comes to that. We have a very small dock. And then the front of house, where what we see in modern conventions is they use the front space, whether it's to get a cup of coffee and sit down and meet with colleagues and share information. Our space that's available for that is very limited. When we talk about what came from the 2013 program, that's where the numbers that we've been talking about come from. 150,000 square feet of contiguous space. We should be considering, because again, we're talking about the future, about an additional 100,000 square feet sometime in the future may be needed. So we should also consider that as we look forward. 30,000 square feet of subdividable for ballroom space and 30,000 feet of meeting rooms. Also, the report told us that we would probably need more hotels at that time. Since 2013, however, the hotel market has grown. And I'm not sure that this information, if we looked back to Bill and asked him, that the current numbers that we have in and around Century 2 would call for another 100 rooms at the Hyatt. But it certainly, if it did, would need to be a study done separately from this one. This was never looked at to look at the hotel space. Let's talk about performing arts. When we commissioned AMS and Fisher Dack and Associate to do this. Over 85 of the respondents believe there's a need for a new or renovated performing arts center. The majority stated their utilization would increase if we were to meet their needs. 57% of the potential users would use C2 if it was upgraded to meet their needs. 63% of the current users use C2 more if it was upgraded to meet those needs. Now, one of the challenges is with Century 2 and the performing arts side is obviously the arts organizations have done a wonderful job of adapting and using the space. But in terms of industry standards, wing space, stage sound, sound lead, loading docks, number and condition of dressing rooms, a new shell is needed, too few fly lines, and the number of rehearsal rooms throughout the facility could be increased. AV equipment, union costs we heard was an impediment for organization, and then accessibility into the theater is also a challenge for the type of theater that we have. Other things that groups told the consultants were small flexible space for a black box, a bar or restaurant attached, a parking structure, which is critical for patron and dealing with patron needs, banquet facilities, thrush stage, some outdoor exhibit space. These are all things that we heard from the surveys that we took of performing arts groups. This again was done in 2014. So what does the building program look for a performing arts center? It's a 2,200 seat multi-purpose facility similar to the size that Concert Hall is today. Stage and backstage area size for Broadway touring as well as Music Theater of Wichita. Trap room, orchestra pit, a larger lobby with 15 square feet per person. Patron lounge, multi-purpose events size for live. Again, what's also critical, and we've been making sure that we continue to this discussion, is making sure that we replicate the types of scene shops, costume shops, and the ancillary space to make sure that Music Theater Wichita and our other tenants are successful in continuing doing what they've been doing over the life of their organization. So we want to make sure those things are also included within the facility under the same roof. What I'm about to show you is schemes that were developed by Populous. This was, again, block planning. This is not designing a building. Scheme 1 is talking about just if you took the footprint of the current building, what would it cost to upgrade it? There are aesthetics. About 40% of the facility would be gutted and renovated. We also, in this number here, also addressing the sound issue, we would look at a way to isolate one theater within the current facility so that we could address some of the sound concerns that we currently have. That's also within this number. What we want to look at is this is to meet ADA requirements as well as keeping the space in the skyline. It does not add space or create ideal structure for the convention center. It does not add parking. It reduces the amount of space for a convention center. If we fix the Performing Arts Center, we're going to have to take it from somewhere. And it would bring the Performing Arts and Conventions, it would not bring the Performing Arts and Convention Centers into what we call current standards. Well, what does the cost benefit look like for that? Well, it's about $2. It's $2 for every public dollar invested. That's what it looks like. You can see the direct spending, the indirect spending. This is if the city was to choose to invest that type of money. This is the type of return that was estimated. Scheme 2 breaks down the convention center, showing it as a convention center, the round building, and building a performing arts center off-site. In this particular rendering, we're showing the Performing Arts Center on the Allison site, but it could be anywhere. It could be in different locations throughout the city. We did not, for this purpose, decide that it was important to us to look at the location so much as really looking at this from a block planning stage of where those locations would be. In this scheme, what you see is the Performing Arts Center would cost you about $117 million, the Convention Center about $206. But what's important is we also want to make sure we're realistic about building in money for parking as well as site development. If we're going to rearrange streets, if we're going to do some of that, we need to make sure those costs are also looked at. This keeps the current structure in the skyline. It adds additional space for convention. What really is important here is that it would also continue to put the convention business behind from the standpoint of marketability. And also, if you'll remember earlier when I talked about subdividable space, the challenge with the current round building is the center of the building is supported by the center. And so creating air walls that would divide the space in equal spaces would be difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. Well, what's the cost benefit? It's about $2.30 if you look at it from that perspective. Scheme 3, which again we have to look at from the standpoint of what would happen if we started building new. What would that look like and what sort of cost would be needed for that? Here again, we have $124 million for a Performing Arts Center, $254 for a convention center, $40 million is for parking, and about $72 million is in site development under this scheme. And again, these are estimates based on square footage. There's a lot more information that would be needed to firm up these estimates. But what this does is this gives you the idea of a shared parking structure that would be shared both by the convention center and the Performing Arts Center. The other advantage of this particular scheme was that that shared parking structure could be in the future looked at for expansion, which is something that we want to keep in mind. This completely redesigns it. We do remove the blue roof from the skyline. It would require a phased approach. We would recommend a phased approach for any scheme that's selected as we move forward. Again, it would be detrimental to the tenant organizations to have them either try to relocate or put them in an idle position. That would not be something that would be successful for them. Again, when we look at this, you get a 3-to-1, and you can see that the direct and indirect spending, and again, a lot of this has to do with marketability for conventions, as well as the performing arts side of it. Well, Scheme 4 basically takes that same concept, but now moves the Performing Arts Center off-site. So again, we're looking at it from the standpoint of saying, if we're going to build new, here's a scheme that shows that. You will also notice in the last two schemes, one shows the library remaining, the other one doesn't. We've never used the library as something that we studied at all. We simply say it can be there, it may not be, depending on the decision the elected body makes. Again, here you have $117 million for a Performing Arts Center, $238 for the convention, $40 in the parking, and $88 in site development. Again, it's important to note that those numbers, again, are taking in consideration some type of development that has to occur. We're also not saying that these are sited where they'll end up. We want to make sure we take advantage of the river, and none of these block plannings do that. They're simply there to show you the site. Completely redesigns under number 4. It removes, again, the blue dome from the skyline. It provides limited parking with the off-site that we're showing with the Allison site. As to parking for the Performing Arts Center, we did not address a separate parking structure for it. Doesn't mean that that shouldn't be thought through, but again, at this phase, we did not follow through with that. Well, again, $2.95 to one investment, and again, you see the added advantage of the 10-year totals as the cost-benefit analysis. Its estimated new building would generate about $57 million in annual economic output, both direct and indirect, and about 781 full-time jobs. Again, each scheme is different, so I don't want to dwell too much on this particular slide, but again, the economic benefit changes based on the scheme that would be selected if we would want to go down that path. This is, again, it's really hard to read, and I apologize for that, but this is just putting all 4 schemes on a page. And I know for the audience, they can download these documents, and it makes it a little easier to understand and see them side by side, both in terms of direct, indirect spending. Well, let's talk a little bit about the business. The manager mentioned that. This represents, if you look at a trending for 5 years, we basically classify our events into 3 categories. When you look at Century 2, you got to think of that as 3 separate business models. One is convention, one is performing arts, and then what we call in-town events or local events. We've all attended either the Lawn, Flower, and Garden Show or the new landscape show or home show or bridal fair. Those are in-town events. Those are all important to Century 2 and what we do, and we don't want to lose sight of that. And as you can see, the trend, unfortunately, both in convention and in the in-town events is trending downward. Performing arts continues to be stable, and we're very happy about that. And that has a lot to do with the success of our tenants in the organization. They continue to drive good audiences to their event and then allowing us. The challenge for performing arts is always available dates, and that's part of the information that's available for people to look at in the AMS study. Well, let's talk about what numbers look like. Performing arts, again, 15-16, we're showing about 180,000 people in attendance. We break this down to events and event days. In-town events, the same sort of thing. And then convention, we show 176. It's a little deceiving because 23 are conventions that utilize the entire facility. A lot of these are one-day meetings that use a meeting space and then they're done. But as you can see through the attendance numbers, you can see that decline where again, convention attendance continues to decline. We're proud of the fact that we're serving about 500,000 people, however. I think that's important to recognize that Century 2 is well utilized even in its current state and continues to be an asset to this community. What I want to end with is the current site. This is important because, again, all the work we gave to the consultants wants to focus on this site, and recognizing that the current site, the Hyatt, is no longer owned by the city, and the building in the corner there at Douglas is not owned by the city, but most of the site is city property, and that allows us flexibility to look at it from a design perspective and what can we do with it. With that, I'm going to let Ignacio come up and talk about the ARUP report that we just completed.
Thank you, John. And thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Bob, for inviting me to Wichita and making me feel welcome here. And it's an honor to be here before you to present the findings of our study. My name is Ignacio Barandiaran, and I'm a principal in ARUP's office in San Francisco. I'm going to first walk you quickly through the agenda of the presentation. First, I'm going to give you an introduction to the ARUP team, since you may not know us so well. I'm also going to quickly touch on the background to recap some of the main points that John made, as well as the scope of this particular study. Then I'm going to give you a sneak preview of what the key findings are, and which will be followed by a more detailed explanation of the analysis that we did and how we came to those findings. And then we'll close with a discussion on the options for development strategy and conclusions as the next step. So first, let me introduce you to ARUP, and who is ARUP? Well, first of all, ARUP is actually a name of a person. I'm often asked, what does ARUP stand for? It's actually our founder, Sir Ove Arup, who started a company in 1946 in London. He was an engineer and a builder. And he started the company with the belief that teams of people with diverse skills and empowered to make decisions would be in a position to potentially make the best possible projects. And so the company we're a consulting and engineering company. We're now in more than 40 countries around the world, 13,000 employees. We're actually an employee-owned company. And as you can see, we have 9 offices in the United States, in San Francisco, where I am based. And some of the projects that we've worked on that are relevant in this discussion. So actually, Ove Arup was the engineer who designed the Sydney Opera House back in the 1970s, which was an iconic project and still very much an iconic project for Arup, but also closer to Wichita. We were the engineers who were part of the design team for the Kaufman Center in Kansas City. And also the nexus for our engagement on this project was the work that we've been doing for the city of Los Angeles on their convention center, which is now in the process of developing a public-private partnership with a developer. And I also want to mention some of our partners that we've worked with on this assignment. We brought together a team of specialists in convention centers, performing arts centers, and also in a real estate company, Newmark, to help us look at the local real estate market. Some of the questions that you may have, and please interrupt as I go along in the presentation if anything is not clear. I'll try to answer all of the questions, but there might be some more specialized questions that I may have to refer to after the presentation to one of my colleagues. So, background for the study. As John said, the Century 2 facility is an important asset for Wichita, and it's a very significant that it drives over 500,000 visitors per year. Unfortunately, on the other hand, as John explained, there are a number of factors that have been causing attendance to stagnate and in some cases even decline. And that's been due to a number of factors as we've discussed so far in this presentation. but primarily they relate to physical and operational challenges of the facility itself. So the scope of this study really was to, the first discussions that we had with Bob was intended really to help the city frame and develop an investment strategy that would be aligned with the economic development goals as well as the budget and fiscal realities that you face. So with that in mind, the scope of the study had three main points. The first one was to make an assessment of what would be the net cost from the city's perspective of delivering 2 out of the 4 design schemes that were presented previously, that had been developed previously. And specifically considering alternative or additional revenue sources that could be developed for the project to help to offset some of those costs. The second was to identify and evaluate at a qualitative level the operational performance of the facility and whether there are opportunities to improve on the operations, given that there are continuing and in fact growing operating deficits year on year. And then thirdly, based on the first 2 points, to develop a series of recommendations on the development strategy. So the 2 concepts that were evaluated were concepts 1 and 3 out of the same ones that were presented previously. And we took the cost estimates for both as they were presented. So we didn't. It's very important to note in this study that we conducted, we haven't done additional design work or looking at design options, but really working with all of the information and the studies that have been done up to this date. One thing that I want to mention about the concept 1, which is very important, is that because it's in a renovation of the existing facility, and the facility is getting on 50 years, actually it was built around the time when I was born, it's showing its age, as am I perhaps. One of the challenges is really that renovating a facility while it's in operation, it's very difficult, and that raises the cost significantly. So when I first saw the $272 million price tag for concept 1, it was a bit of a shock for me to see that number. But in fact, there is even more risk, even on top of that number, I would say. So that's something to bear in mind when all of the analysis that we've done is some of the risk factors that you have when you look at renovation versus a new build. So what are the key findings? And again, this is a sort of sneak peek of what I will be explaining in more detail in the presentation. So the first finding is that because of that risk factor related to renovation of an existing facility while it's in operation, concept 1, we looked at a range of different types of procurement for the construction project. And for concept 1, we found that the P3 procurement would not be a viable solution, precisely because of that risk factor. The second finding is that for then looking at the cost of concepts 1 and 3, even after we netted out the additional revenue sources that we looked at, and I'll describe what those revenue sources are in a minute, but even after netting out those revenue sources, in both cases, for either concept 1 or 3, there would be a significant net cost to deliver the facility, and it would be our estimates indicated $27 million per year over 30 years. So that's a significant long-term investment for concept 1. And then for concept 3, which could be delivered either by a design bid build or a P3, and I will describe that in more detail later, the cost would be in the order of $42 million per year. So clearly, concept 3 would be more expensive because it's all new construction, and it builds more square footage than what's existing today. The related to this finding, but is that one of the components of the analysis that fed into that net cost analysis was the revenue sources. So we looked at any number of possibilities that could be feasible for the project, and we identified in particular three particular revenue sources that could be developed. The first one has to do with naming rights, the second one with advertising, and the third one with real estate development, jointly developed with the project on the site that John described in this previous slide. And what we found is that depending on different scenarios, particularly for the real estate, that you could generate up to $30 million of upfront funding that could be used to support the project. Now, clearly, the bad news, of course, that's $30 million is not an insignificant number, but the bad news is that it's significantly below what would be required to deliver either concepts 1 or 3. One important point, though, about the joint real estate development opportunities is that one of the things that we have found in projects around the world is that the success of convention center projects is not only related to the funding and the financing, but also how the development around the convention center can support the function of the convention center itself. So being a more attractive destination actually has a significant support for the marketability of the facility and so on. A good example of that, for example, is the city of San Antonio developed the Riverwalk, which is a great amenity for the city and for the citizens, of course, but also has benefited the convention center to attract more visitors to it. So joint real estate development strategy should also be thought of in terms of the synergies that it can generate with the convention center, in addition to the revenue generating potential. The next finding related to the operational improvements. And that's something that it's a complex matter because it has to do with not only with the day-to-day operations, but also the governance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the summary finding from that is that there is an opportunity to potentially very substantially reduce, or even in some cases eliminate, the current $2 million a year deficit. And that based on numbers that were provided by Bob's staff, those operational savings could be capitalized and could be translated into upfront funding of the order of up to $55 million. So that's another significant source of funding that could be used to support the construction of the project. And then finally, given that these, when you sum it all up, the up to $30 million and the $55 million, it's $85 million, which is, again, not an insignificant sum of money. However, being significantly below what would be required for those design concepts that were previously developed, it means that if you have a scenario without any additional tax revenue sources to support the project, you could still, the message I'm trying to convey here is that there is still a strategy for a phased development of the project that could be market-driven, and I would have 3 main elements. The first one is...
Let me stop you there for a second.
Yes.
The numbers I looked at, I'm a little confused at. In your report, you said that it would take 10 million would generate 100 million in infrastructure. So $10 million
Yes.
payment would relate to a $100 million building.
That's right.
So how does saving 2 million get us to 55 million? That seems like a bit of a gap when you said 10 million only generates 100 million.
So, Bob, I think maybe this is something that Sorry, that figure was provided to us by
It was a black box calculation, and
So in their
our
report,
staff went
they,
through over the 30-year period, if we were able, and also with that increasing, we looked at the trend, because that trend has been increasing over a period of time. And I don't have the calculations here in front of me, but over that 30-year period of time, if you capitalize that savings, you would be able to afford up to $55 million a project.
okay.
Yeah. Also, I should note the ratio of $10 million per year to $100 million. That's $100 million of base construction cost. So in addition to that, you have a risk factor on contingency on construction, and then you also have life cycle cost as well as financing costs. So the ratio is actually, if you added all of those things together, would be different and perhaps more comparable to the number that was provided. Okay, I'm going to skip this part, and because we're going to come back to what this phase development strategy consists of. All right. So in terms of the evaluation of the net cost to deliver the concepts 1 and 3, the first, I should just very quickly say that the method of analysis consisted of first looking at the suitability of different project delivery methods as relates to both of these concepts. Then we looked at what those alternative funding sources would be. And then the third step was to estimate the net city payment, which was basically, it's a financial calculation that takes account of the construction cost, the risk factor on construction, life cycle cost, and financing cost, deducting the benefit that you get from the funding sources. So in terms of the first step of that in that process is to look at the delivery methods and the risk allocation. So when we look at delivery methods, there's a range of options that could be looked at. Typically, projects in the United States are delivered with a design bid build, public projects, I should say, are delivered with a design bid build method of procurement, which is on the left of this chart. That typically means that the cities and agencies are using tax-exempt financing that is basically, general obligation debt or that type of municipal debt. And most of the decisions on the design and construction are being made by the city or the agency. And therefore, most of the risks are being borne by the public sector. At the other end of this spectrum, there's a range of other alternatives, which basically what they mean is that there's an increasing shift of the responsibilities that are passed over to the private sector. So typically, even though construction, even in a design bid build, the design itself and the construction itself is being done by private sector companies, when you move to the right of this chart, more of those risks are being passed over to those entities and in a more integrated way, and I'll explain that in a minute. So the reason to look at what is the motivation for looking at alternative delivery methods? Well, there are several. One of them is to look at, for example, the development of alternative revenue sources, like the ones that we discussed earlier with joint real estate development, as an example. But another one also has to do with the controlling costs. So traditionally, when you look at the history of projects, which can be very, can vary widely depending on many different factors. But one of them has to do with the size and complexity of the project. And in general, a number of studies, and including some that we have done, looking at larger and more complex projects, especially projects that involve renovating existing facilities, the cost overruns and schedule delays tend to be significant. So in one study that we looked at, for example, where we took an average over many projects, we found that in a greenfield project, the average cost overrun was on the order of 39%. Because of that, in many places, because of that experience, in many places, governments have been experimenting with alternative delivery methods to try to improve on the performance of the construction cost and schedule. And so around the US, but also in many other countries, like for example in Canada, it's very common to use public-private partnerships for public infrastructure projects. The experience has been that P3 type of delivery has actually improved the performance of the cost and schedule delivery of projects. And I want to emphasize that this is typically when you're dealing with large and complex projects. But there are also trade-offs, and one of them is that the financing costs that are borne in the private sector tend to be higher than tax-exempt financing in the public sector. So the key question when you look at all of this is you have to put it all in the balance, and you have to evaluate whether the potential benefits from improved cost and schedule delivery are outweighed by the financial costs. But the two things are related. This diagram, what it attempts to show is diagrammatically, what is the risk allocation or how the risks are allocated between the public and the private sector, and including some costs, some risks which are shared. And so in a design bid build delivery, which is the traditional one in the US, this is a fairly common risk allocation picture. And what you try to do when you look at P3 delivery is to take some of those risks and transfer them to the private sector. And the key here is that, and the reason for the difference in the cost of financing is that typically the entity that has financed the project is the one that ultimately holds most of the risks. So by transferring the financing along with all the other risks is what tends to deliver the most benefit in terms of cost and schedule. So from that perspective, we looked at the two design concepts that we talked about, and we analyzed them from a perspective of across multiple criteria in terms of design bid build and P3 delivery. And what we concluded from that study, which is also based on speaking with participants in the market, with developers, builders, and financiers, is that a project like Concept 1, which is essentially a renovation of the existing facility, would not be viable as a P3 delivery, as I mentioned before. Whereas Concept 3 could be viable either as design bid build or P3. So on that basis, we continued the analysis by looking at design bid build for Concept 1, and both design bid build and P3 delivery for Concept 3 to do the comparative analysis for that one. The next step, as I mentioned, was the look at the study of the alternative funding sources, and these were summarizes the three that we looked at, as I mentioned before. It's important to note here that when we looked at this, we looked at the conceptual master plans that have been developed previously and identified potential sites for development. Now, some of these may or may not be actually feasible to develop once you take into consideration a number of factors, like, for example, the question of what is going to be the decision on the use of the library and that site, whether that site is redeveloped or not. But we took the most sort of optimistic view on that, and in terms from a revenue generating perspective, and based on benchmarks as well as the real estate market analysis for the Wichita market, these were the values that we were able to evaluate. So, putting all of that, construction costs, life cycle costs, risk factors, looking at that with a financial model, looking at your financing costs, both from a tax-exempt financing perspective as well as a private financing perspective. We were able to estimate what the annual cost, net cost to the city would be to deliver concepts 1 and 3 with the different delivery methods as summarized in the table. And so here you can see it just summarizes the numbers that I showed you earlier. And in particular, I want to point out that in the case of concept 3, where you have 2 potential different delivery methods, that the P3 delivery method would give you a modest savings of about $3 million per year relative to a design bid build delivery. So you might ask yourself, well, has this been done before? Can you show us an example? This is an example. There are many examples of P3 projects in the United States that I could show you, but this one in particular I thought would be relevant, even though it's not in the U.S. It's in Melbourne, Australia. It's an interesting case because it involves a convention center. And it also involves a joint real estate development. So it's a little bit unique structure in that sense. And what the city of Melbourne did with their project is they had the long rectangular building that you see on the picture on the lower right-hand corner. It was the existing facility, which they wanted to renovate, but they also wanted to expand with new facilities to diversify and increase the space offering that they had with their convention center. And so the building right in the middle with that kind of diamond shape, the darker color building is the new convention center. And what they did is they ran a competitive procurement process where they said to the potential bidders, they said, the city is willing to invest $285 million in net present value, and no more. And we are going to select the developer who gives us the most program for that amount of money. And by the way, there's a piece of land adjacent to the convention center that you're welcome to propose real estate development concepts. And so the winning bidder really that came back from that process was the one that bid the $285 million capped public investment, but in addition to that, was able to build more convention center than just what the number allowed. And in addition to that, built a hotel development with restaurants and bars, offices and retail, and even a new pedestrian bridge across the river. So it was a very significant, now of course the commercial part of the development supports itself because they did the market analysis and they came to that conclusion. But what it does is the land value that they were able to capture from that development, they used to cross-subsidize into the public infrastructure, the bridge and the convention center that don't generate commercial or don't generate the same type of commercial revenues. So it's a very interesting, in my opinion, very interesting example of how you can use these types of structures to not only deliver the P3 project, which by the way was finished on time and on budget, but also to create value, both in terms of the funding, but also that in terms of the use of the convention center. Because now, in addition to the funding that they were able to generate, they have a 500-room Hilton hotel adjacent to their convention center, which they didn't have before, as well as the restaurants along the riverfront and the connection to the downtown with the pedestrian bridge. So a very significant upside from that perspective as well. Okay, so now we'll shift a little bit to the operations review. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in terms of what the challenges are. I think that's been well documented. What is important, of course, is what that has resulted in. And that has resulted in the decline in attendance, but also the operational deficits that we mentioned before. So working with our consultants specializing in both convention centers and performing arts centers, we looked at a number of areas of potential improvement. Now, we looked at these qualitatively. This didn't go into a detailed quantitative analysis of the cost and the revenues, but based on the analysis that we were able to do, we do think that there are opportunities for significant improvement. The first observation overall is that there would be a benefit for both the Performing Arts Center and the Convention Center if the operations of the two were separated more clearly, especially because each requires specialized expertise, not so much from a facilities management perspective, the management of the hard, the actual building itself, but more from the point of view of the marketing of the facilities. And so they would actually benefit from having more specialized and separated groups of people looking at that, and each one working with a different set of metrics. So in terms of, that's the first overall observation. Then the second, in relation to the convention center, is that there's an opportunity when you look at other convention centers around the country, like in Chicago and Cleveland. What they have done is they have broadened the governance of their convention centers to look at what is not only the impact to the city, but also to the region. And so broadening the governance to more of perhaps a county level entity that could also, so that could generate additional resources, but also you could look at the managing multiple related or similar facilities, for example, the convention center and the Intrust Arena, that could actually yield much improved marketing, but also efficiencies in the operating cost when you have those kind of economies of scale that you don't have right now. The third one is related to the management structure. And this is perhaps a little bit more kind of brass tacks issue, but we found that the organizational chart of how the management of the convention center is structured right now is not doesn't align optimally with how the industry operates, and so there could be some improvements there. And then finally, there could be some improvements in some of the contracts, particularly in food and beverage, where the revenue sharing formula that exists today is not the most favorable for from the convention center's perspective. So if that was looked at together with a capital project, a major capital project for expansion of the convention center, perhaps there would be an opportunity to relook at that contract with a better operating result for the convention center. So there are case studies, and sorry, one main thing that I forgot to mention is also in all of that, we think that looking at options of bringing a private operator and potentially a private operator / developer could also help in realizing some of those operational improvements for the convention center. And that, which leads me to a case study of this project in Iowa, which is a fairly recent deal that was struck by the city of Waterloo to bring in a private operator developer who is going to make $20 million of investment in the hotel and the convention center there in exchange for tax rebates over a certain period of time of the contract, but without any investment from the city other than the tax rebates and eliminating all of the previous operating deficits that the city had been carrying. So that's an example of a project that could show the way of similar improvements. In terms of the,
So stop there for a second again.
Yeah.
So you're saying that shows an example of similar improvements. They're making a $20 million investment.
yes.
How is that similar to a $300 million investment?
So it wouldn't be coupled, it would have to be coupled with a, in your case, where you have to make a much larger capital investment. The developer is not going to, to bring that type of investment on its own, on a purely commercial basis. But it points to the operational improvements on the operating side of the equation. And that you could have, on the margin, you could have additional capital investment that could be co-invested alongside the public investment, if there was a public investment available. Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that it would be, you could finance such a large project.
I see very little similarities between these two projects.
Okay.
I'm sorry, so was Waterloo itself on the public side also making an investment? Or no, you're just showing this as an example of private investment on an existing facility?
Correct, yeah. And really what I wanted to emphasize is the operational side of this example, yeah. Okay, in the Performing Arts Center, there is there are opportunities there as well. It's a different, performing arts is quite different than convention center. So the dynamics here would be quite different. But there are examples around the country of successfully bringing third-party private operators into a performing arts scenario that can lead to improving the marketing and the revenues of the facilities. Obviously, there are concerns that the nonprofit groups typically have in these arrangements. And so what we've seen in the successful examples around the country is that those operating contracts would have clauses that give access or adequate access. And so the cities and the groups have gone through an extensive process of determining what is the adequate access that they would have, and then that gets written into those contracts so that you maintain that part of it. Because obviously, a goal of performing arts is not primarily financial. It's primarily to improve is to act as an asset for the community, as well as to build performing arts audiences. It's only after that the financial consideration comes into play, but it's not an insignificant one, especially if you're running at a deficit. And so that's one recommendation, and the second one is really related to the capital improvement side of the project, where one of the constraints of the current facility is, due to its physical layout, is the limited ability to develop additional revenue sources from ancillary uses, such as food service, for example, in the pre-function areas. And so that would be something coupled with a capital improvement project where you could diversify the revenue sources to put the Performing Arts Center on a better footing. And again, a case study that illustrates that point is a project in Durham, North Carolina. There are other projects as well, for example, in Virginia Beach and Homestead, Florida, a couple of others. But this one in particular stands out in my mind. It was a project that was built by the city of Durham in 2008. It was a combination of public investment and philanthropic contributions. And right from the beginning, it had a long-term private operator agreement with a group of two companies, one specializing in performing arts, developing performing arts shows, and as well as marketing, and another group focusing on the facilities management side. And I think that project has been very successful since it was built, and has it has the feature of that contractual clause that allows the local groups to have adequate access to the facility, as well as the private operator to be able to develop the more commercial side of the facility. And that has meant that the project, for example, in 2016, the revenue sharing provision of the contract contributed $1.8 million back to the city. And that $1.8 million, the city has agreed to reinvest back into the facility in terms of ongoing capital improvements. So, for example, if they have to replace carpet or things like that, they use that source of revenue to maintain the facility.
So just to clarify, what you're suggesting here, these opportunities for operational improvement, these things would apply to either of the scenarios that we're looking at?
Correct.
Right, regardless of what we do with replacement or renovation, these are operational improvements.
Yes, that's correct, and it's regardless of whether you do it as a design bid build or P3. Generally, though, I would say that within the P3 scenarios, because you have more of that operations being done more inherently under a private scenario, they align better. But you could do it on a design bid build delivery of the capital project, and then you could apply some of these concepts for the operations. I will say, though, that to be able to achieve a goal of eliminating completely the operating deficit would not be easy, and in fact would likely only be feasible once you also invest in the capital side of the equation, right? Because, so for example, to develop some of the revenues for food service, for instance, there would be some capital investments that would be needed, as well as addressing the deferred maintenance and so on and so forth. Another significant, the next after labor cost, which is typically always the highest cost item in any facility like this, the next one at Century 2 is energy. And not surprisingly, given that it's a 50-year-old facility. If you build that facility today, most likely the energy used would be a third, or a half or a third of what it is today, just simply because of the type of construction. So to recap what I said before, that why look at all of these operating improvements? Well, there are a number of reasons that have to do with improving the operations of the facility from an economic development perspective, for the services it provides to the city of Wichita, but also the implications it potentially has in terms of the capital funding of the project. So the discussion that we had earlier, if you were able to eliminate completely the $1.8 million per year current deficit, but is expected to grow in coming years. Next year, I think, or this year rather, it's expected to be closer to $2 million. Based on the estimates that were provided by Bob's staff, that could generate up to the $55 million of upfront funding that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, which could be used to support construction costs for some of these improvements that would be necessary. So the two things ultimately go hand in hand, but there is a significant upside in considering the operational improvements. Okay, so now I'm going to try to summarize this in terms of what does it mean from a strategic options perspective. So the first question that you really ask yourself is, based on all of this analysis, is what is ultimately the capacity and the willingness to invest tax dollars? Clearly, the strategies that we looked at in terms of real estate development, operational improvements, naming rights, et cetera, are not nearly enough to fund the aspirational, let's say, capital project, the $492 million capital project. And so the first path strategically would be to consider, well, in order to, if that's ultimately my goal, is to develop that project, then I have to fill a significant gap and the only way to do that would be with an additional tax burden. So that would mean the implication of that would be to look at the feasibility of raising new tax revenue sources that don't exist today to support that level of 30-year commitment. So, for example, in the Concept 3 project, the one that gives the highest economic return on investment of factor of 3, that would be in the order of $42 to $45 million per year for 30 years. Depending on the delivery method, whether it's P3 or design bid build. And so obviously that, if that was feasible, then you have a lot more options. But the reason we were even doing this analysis in the first place is because of the obvious difficulties of generating that type of new tax revenue sources. So then we looked at what is another path where you try to work with what you have without an additional tax burden. So that means the capital funding that you potentially have available, and there's a lot of ifs that go into reaching these numbers, are in the range of $77 to $85 million when you add it all up. That's the depending on the choices you make in terms of the real estate development, for example. That means that you would have to do some real prioritization as to what would be the capital investments that would give you the highest return on investment. But also, it would mean that you also have to look at what, for example, when you look at the Performing Arts Center, are there other sources that have not yet been looked at, for example, philanthropic contributions or other private investments from an operator/developer for the convention center that might be in addition to this 77 to 85 million. So to us, what that picture tells us is that there is a potential path forward there, which is what I call a market-driven, phased strategy. Okay, so let's go back now to path number one. In terms of path number one, with the additional tax burden, the options are the ones that are summarized in the slide. So basically, one option would be something similar to what was done for the Intrust Bank Arena, which would be to look at a temporary increase in sales tax. Now, of course, that was different because that was a county sales tax, and this is potentially would be a city sales tax. So it would make it, the tax base would be smaller. Another would be tax increment financing, which you have used in the past. However, because it has been already used in the past, it actually is, for the convention center in particular, is very limited. And then you also have, of course, the other sources that we already talked about. So in terms of path number one, these are the options that would be available to go forward. In terms of path number two, which is to work with the sources that you have, I think the main observation here is that even though it's not a great news story, there is a positive side in that the funding that would be available if you did all those things would be enough to start the development of a project and you would have to prioritize which part of the project is most important to start with and would be most feasible to start with. But I would say that if you started down that path and you put in place the type of operational improvements and a capital plan that had a funding source or a series of funding sources like the ones that we've talked about, in my experience and based on what I've looked at around the country in other projects and talking with developers and financiers, is that you would be able to attract additional private investment to complement that. That additional private investment wouldn't be, to answer your question, Mr. Mayor, it wouldn't be enough to get you from that level of funding up to a 300 million plus project, but would be an additional source that could improve the positioning, for example, of the convention center. So our recommendation in relation to the Bob Brown Hall would be to study engagement with a long-term lease of a private operator to explore the possibilities of what would be the market potential for that, both in terms of the operational side of it, but also in terms of what a private operator would be willing to invest alongside the city's investment. I would also look at, in terms of the performing arts facilities, because of all the difficulties that John documented in his presentation in relation to the current physical layout, as well as the acoustic isolation issues and so on and so forth, in our view, in the long term, it's probably a better strategy to invest, if you're going to make a major investment in the Performing Arts Center, to do so in a brand new facility that fundamentally corrects what those inherent deficiencies are in the round building. Now, that's not to say that when you look at the round building, that necessarily means you demolish the round building. We do think that there are, and I'll show a couple of examples of adaptive reuse of the round building, which in the near to midterm could continue to include performing arts, or not. That would be an option. But the adaptive reuse could be another way to look at the Blue Dome in a way that allows it to continue to serve its purpose in downtown Wichita. So those two scenarios, I guess we could summarize in these two snapshots. One of them includes keeping the Blue Dome building and repurposing it, and it would have the characteristics summarized there, including 9 acres of joint real estate development to help fund the project. And in the other scenario, if you were to demolish the building, it would give you the ability to have a greater amount of joint development, perhaps more flexibility with the expansion of the convention center, and slightly more funding available in that scenario. So when we talk about, I wanted to finish this section of the presentation by giving some illustrative examples of both performing arts as well as the adaptive reuse of the Blue Dome. So one of the things that when we look at the performing, the theater in the Blue Round building, clearly, with perhaps some minimal investments, you could continue to operate the theater in the building for some time. But longer term, as I said, we would recommend that you look at other options. And one way to look at the development of a phase strategy to go from where you are today to those longer term permanent new home for performing arts would be to look at relatively low-cost interim facilities. And these are just examples. I'm not saying that these are what you need in Wichita by any stretch, but these are examples that are of what people are doing creatively around the country and around the world to solve exactly the same problem that you're facing. So this is a concept that was developed to basically recreate the famous Globe Theatre, Shakespearean Globe Theatre in London, using shipping containers. A $6 million project is going to be built in Detroit that can seat 1,500 people for Shakespearean type of performances. Now, obviously, not every theatrical performance can be held there. It's a very unique type of building, but it gives you an example. Another example is a project that we were involved in London, which is a project with I believe this building has a 15-year life, and it's a black box theater that has been very successful to be used on an interim basis as part of the National Theatre development on the South Bank of London, as another example. And there are many others. I'm just giving you two here as a flavor. And then I want to close with, in terms of the repurposing of the Blue Dome, one of the things that the real estate market study revealed was that there is in downtown a gap in the market. There's a need for grocery and food service. And so when we look at around the country for examples, these were a couple of examples close to where I live. The Ferry Building on the waterfront in San Francisco, and this project, which is also in San Francisco by Creasy Field. I don't know if you've been there, you might know it. The Palace of Fine Arts, which was a building, was erected in 1915, so quite a bit older than Century 2. And both of these projects went through competitive development proposal processes to solicit proposals from development teams for their adaptive reuse. In the case of the Palace of Fine Arts, which I wanted to highlight, it actually has a theater inside it that will be preserved as part of the project, as well as development of a museum. So there's two nonprofit users that will continue to be part of the building, and a 60,000 square foot food court and retail development in the middle of the building. Now, this is unique because it's prime real estate in a very, very high traffic area of San Francisco. So just with the revenue that can be generated by that 60,000 square foot retail development, the developer can pay for the entire project, which involves $150 million capital investment, as well as all of the operating costs thereafter. So because of that unique position, it's a very attractive financial proposal. Not necessarily achievable in every location, and perhaps not in the Century 2 site where you may not have the same type of traffic characteristics, but nevertheless, a very interesting example of adaptive reuse with a commercial component. So to conclude, I think it's pretty clear from my remarks so far that the alternative funding streams that we have analyzed in this study are able to generate significant funding, but not in a way to meaningfully reduce the new tax commitment that would be needed if you were to deliver either concepts 1 or 3. But having said that, with a combination of changes to governance, operations, and management, as well as looking at the operational improvements and the additional revenue sources, that could potentially provide the basis for a significant opportunity to redevelop the Century 2 facility going forward and into the future, and to do so in a way that could either have no new tax revenue commitments or to really limit those commitments to something that is affordable for the city. So our specific recommendations for next steps in relation to those findings, the first is to initiate a process to consider in more detail what would be the alternative governance and management and operational models for the Convention Center and the Performing Arts Center. And then to do, in parallel with that, to conduct a market sounding, speaking with developers to get more detailed feedback on the three components of the project, the Bob Brown Expo Hall, the Performing Arts Center, and the repurposing of the Blue Dome building. So with that, I think I'll close, and Bob, I'll pass it to you.
Before you pass it off to Bob,
Yeah.
you know, when we had talked last year with Arab, we had looked at potentially some P3 models similar to what LA was doing,
Yes.
where there were developers coming in and finding different revenue streams based on just leasing the land or building the center because of the attendance that it generates around there. I guess I thought you were going to examine that opportunity here also, but I didn't hear any mention of that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sorry if it wasn't clear in my presentation, Mr. Mayor. The idea of the joint real estate development is effectively the one, is exactly that, is to look at joint real estate development that is developed jointly with the development of the convention center in a way that creates the synergies of the one development and the other, and that uses the cross-subsidy of the land value captured in order to finance in part, the project.
And the case of LA, they didn't sell the land. The P3 built the convention center.
Yeah. In the
And
case
then
of
there was an opportunity cost.
That's right. In the case of Los Angeles, as also in the case of Melbourne that I showed you, both of them are based on a 99-year lease, ground lease. The developer leases the land for 99 years and develops the private real estate development on that ground lease land. And then that ground lease revenue
So I'm familiar with it. You don't need to explain that
Yeah.
part to me. I'm kind of familiar with that.
Yes.
What I'm asking you is, then there's not the same opportunity here to do something similar.
It's effectively the same. The way we valued in terms of the valuation of that ground lease, you could think of it either as a revenue stream year on year for 99 years, or a developer paying you that amount up front. And so we looked at it, for simplicity's sake, we looked at it as an upfront payment, and
All right.
that's what the 30 million, the 20
All
to
right.
$30 million
Thank you.
represents.
Thank you. Did anyone else have any questions?
Well, I know this has been a long day for you and also a long presentation, so I want to try to wrap this up, not just the evening's presentation, but more importantly, wrap up for you everything you've heard in terms of the work that's been done to date. And I'm going to make a series of preliminary recommendations to you. Again, as I mentioned at the very front of the presentation, these are preliminary. They're meant to be a starting point for your discussion and the community discussion, and I ask that you take them that way. You'll notice that some of the recommendations do not dovetail nicely with any one of the consultants, but it's supposed to be a blend of what we got from them and utilizes the information that we receive from all the steps going forward. One of the most important things I think A-Rob talked about was the importance of looking at this project in swim lanes, so to speak. Look at Convention Center separately from Performing Arts. And so I'm first going to talk about the Convention Center and Bob Brown. My first recommendation is that we move forward with an expansion of the existing Bob Brown facility in order to get us approximately 150,000 square feet of prime space for convention business. I'm concerned about the cost of doing that on a traditional basis in a design bid build approach. And so in order to try to keep our cost in line, I'd like the ability to also explore construction manager at risk and design, build, operate, or other alternative delivery methods that would allow us to better utilize the private sector in terms of keeping our cost in line with original estimates. I also would like to explore, in addition to that, the long-term lease option that was identified by ARUP to determine whether it has any possibility that could introduce a private partner that could help us on the capital and the operating side. If we, so that's the capital side. We look at the operating side, I think there are a number of options that we can look at. All that could be feasible, and it's up to us to determine what the most appropriate step would be. First of all, we can look at contracting our operations of the convention center with a private management firm, just straight out. It's been discussed before, and before I got here, but it's been discussed by the city previously. Also, we can look at the long-term lease, which has operating benefits as well as the capital that I've already talked about. We could be a little more creative and look at what ARUP talked about in terms of partnerships with other entities, and that would include city-county joint operation of the convention center and the Intrust Bank Arena, and that could bring to bear then the economies of scale that would go with joint operation of those two facilities. And we could look at what's a number of cities have done. In fact, I have a list of about just short of 20 cities that have had their Convention and Visitors Bureau actually operate and manage the facility. And so that would be another model for us to explore. But again, it is important to help us on the capital side that we reduce or eliminate the operating deficit that we currently have in the convention center. As we go forward with the expansion of the convention center, we need to determine if the central library can be incorporated into our plans. Is it possible that that facility could be added or connected to expanded box, convention center box, that would allow us to meet some of our meeting spaces and auxiliary space needs inside that building? And then finally, what I'd like to do is engage the City Council in a discussion that we actually talked about during the budget process, where we put together a long-term capital improvement program and a long-term debt program so that we know what capacity we have inside the capital improvement program to supplement the money that we could, or the revenue that we could generate from the convention center operation as outlined by ARUP. Those are my recommendations on the convention center side. On the performing arts side, what I'm recommending is that we preserve the C2 facility and use it as the home for our performing arts. This building means a lot to a number of people in this community. It is, some would call it iconic. I think it's time that we embrace this facility, but recognize that it needs to be modernized, that it has to not just be representative of the past, but more importantly, represent the needs today and of the future. I think in order to move forward with that, we need to create an advisory committee that brings in expertise from throughout the community, folks who are familiar with engineering and architectural issues, as well as the users, and then other residents who I think have expressed, as we've all heard over the last several months, concerns or appreciation for the facility, but would provide guidance to us in how we modernize. Additionally, we need to look at what we're going to do with the parts of the building that are not devoted to theater. And there are a number of things that we could do. We could look at additional cultural arts spaces. We look at retail opportunities. The best model, I think, is the one that Ignacio talked about in terms of the Palace of Fine Arts. I think I got most excited about the rejuvenation of C2 when I heard about this project. And just a reminder, it has a theater in their project, a museum, as well as retail and food hall. All great opportunities that I think could be modeled here if that's the direction that the committee wants to go and the community wants to go. Also, the thing that was exciting is the way it was financed. I'm not naive. I know we're not going to get to a zero city contribution, but I do think using possibly tax credits and private contributions, we have ability to at least close that gap. And then while we're going through that process, which I anticipate will take a significant amount of time, while we're doing that, I think it's important that we start to address some of the most important or the most obvious maintenance issues that need to be addressed, because if we don't, we'll see long-term costs that will go up. And of course, once we know what the recommendation is of the committee and what we get back from all of our engagement, we need to come up with a long-term financing plan. In terms of my recommendations, I believe that we need to focus first on the convention center piece and then allow for enough time for us to figure out what we're going to do with the repurposing of C2. We know that those current users, although there are some concerns that they have regarding the space, overall they've said it's adequate for today's needs, and that so we're going to be focusing more on the future use of that building, and that does buy us some time if we can address, as long as we address the important maintenance issues. Excuse me. I do think we need to be deliberate about pursuing some of the additional revenue sources that were outlined by ARUP. We need to, as we get ready to move forward with Convention Center project, as well as eventually when we're doing something with C2, we need to talk about the naming rights opportunities. We also need to talk more about the issue that the mayor brought up just a little while ago regarding development opportunities around this, both the expanded convention facility as well as the performing arts facility. However, we can't do that until we know exactly what's necessary for those projects to succeed in terms of available land. And then I think probably the most important thing is that since these are preliminary recommendations, first time you've heard them, first time the community's heard them, it's time for us now to take this out to the public and to talk. I know there'll be people that will support a piece or all of these recommendations. In turn, there'll be people who don't and feel that maybe there's a different direction we should take. So I do think this is, we've reached the time where we can finally start talking about this in a more holistic way and develop a plan to go forward. Just a couple of final comments. I think it's important that, again, as we move forward with the convention center project, that we work hard to recapture our market share. We've not only lost some convention opportunities to neighboring states, but also to neighboring communities. And Overland Park is one that comes to mind that has grabbed a portion of our market share because of what's happened to our facility and some of the functional issues that have been identified. But on top of that, we also need to make sure that we accommodate the local shows that John talked about that are so important, because that represents a significant number of people coming through the facility. So we have to have space that can accommodate and is friendly to our consumer shows, to our festivals, and the other local shows. I think it's important that we respect the history of C2 and what it means to the community, but that we do it in a way that assures our success in the future. And hopefully we'll be able to engage in a way that happens. I do recognize, if we go back to the work that was done by Populous and also the cost benefit, this may not turn out to be the plan that has the highest return on investment to the city, but I do think it's the plan that we can eventually afford and be able to move forward, and I think maybe get out of that paralysis that we've had because of the scope and magnitude of this issue that we've faced in the past. So with that, Mayor, I'd be glad to answer any questions that you or the council members would have. Our team is here and available to drill down on anything else.
So I know we've had this number somewhere, and you probably don't have it with you tonight, but there was a report done on just what you said about 5 minutes ago, opportunity cost lost, and it quantified that. If we did nothing,
Right.
what is that opportunity cost lost? And I think it was more in terms of opportunity costs with the convention center, because the performing arts is more of a quality of life and not so much as an opportunity cost lost there.
Right. We can get that information to you. I know it was contained in the first two reports that were done where we talked about market and the market segments that we were losing. I'll rely on people behind me to see if they can come up with that before we adjourn, but if not, we'll get that information out to you.
And so I would add this. I mean, when you say this might not be the best and most highest return on investment to the community. I would second guess that, because we could still do pretty reasonable a first-rate convention center by utilizing some of the space that we have existing, which none of those other proposals looked at utilizing any existing space in terms of a new convention center. They looked at repurposing Century 2 that didn't give us the Class A convention space that we need.
Right. We'll know we'll be better than the 2-to-1 benefit to cost, because
Right.
we'll have brand-new expanded space, and you're right, on the,
So
We
you
have
could
some
add
revenue
on to
streams
the
as well.
Bob Brown and build perfect dividable Class A convention space. And then potentially, as you're moving that out towards Maine, which would be the most realistic side to do it and save the most money, is there a way to attach it to the current library and save even more on some of that meeting room space that you would need to have with a convention center and pre-convention space? And so there could be more savings
so it's possible
there.
we can reduce our cost versus some of the other scenarios,
And
as well
still
as
pick up
enhance
all
our
of that
revenue.
opportunity
Correct.
cost.
Correct.
And then what you end up ultimately doing with your performing arts space to make it what it needs to be in this community would be a totally separate issue, so to speak, that can still be done.
Right.
But if you don't hold conventions in there, now you've just eliminated one barrier that we have in the performing arts right there.
Right.
So I think there's a real potential to capitalize on all of that opportunity cost lost and still have a incredible return on investment, and utilize what's existing as much as we can and incorporate that into new, but don't settle. I mean, I think we could still build a first-rate convention center that way.
Right. And I haven't recommended that we settle. That would not achieve what we want to achieve.
I'm sorry, what did you just say?
I did not recommend that we settle in terms of our recommendation, or in terms
That
of
we're
the
settling for
construction.
less than Class A convention space.
Right.
In terms
You
of,
wouldn't
say,
want-
settle.
You wouldn't make this investment if you were going to have something
And that if
substandard.
we're just making do with enough space. Other comments? A lot to digest. I'm sure we'll have more to get back with you, and, you know, the community might even weigh in on this with emails and other things. Who knows?
I'd be shocked.
All right.
All right, thank you, Mayor.
Anything else? Councilmember Clendon?
Bob, we've been telling the community that we're going to engage. Do you have any idea what that engagement looks like yet? I know we have our traditional ways of doing that, but
Councilmember Clendenin, that's a great question. We've looked at two alternatives. One that is a little bit traditional, and I didn't cover that in my slide. It was actually in the wording. I want to do an engagement that's conducted by someone else, so that there isn't a feeling that we're trying to maneuver any of the meetings in a way to get to our conclusion or recommendations. So I want it to be neutral in that regard. We've thought about hiring a group to come in and do traditional meetings, do a number of meetings around the community, maybe meet with existing groups as well as some all-comer meetings. But we've also been kicking around the use of a charrette process. So people could talk about the general concepts, they can be drawn out during that meeting, and that when people leave, there's some leave-behinds that allow all of us to see the vision that we're getting from the public discussion. But it is our intention to start that process by the fourth quarter of this year.
I really like the charrette concept, but that really ends up being somewhat small, and it's tough to do in a very, very large group, correct?
It breaks down when you get into a group of 100,
Yeah.
for instance.
Sure,
Right.
okay.
Yeah, let us digest this.
Yep.
All right? Thank you all. Appreciate it.